Britain does not feel like a beginning. It feels like a pause in the middle of something much longer. The land does not announce its age with signs or dates. It carries it quietly, in the way stone walls sink into grass, in the way narrow roads curve where no modern reason remains, in the way villages seem to grow out of the earth instead of being placed upon it. Everything feels settled, but not finished, as if the island has been lived in far longer than its stories admit. When people think of medieval Britain, they imagine castles rising from hills, monks copying texts in candlelight, kings claiming borders with swords and ink. These images feel solid, official, complete. Yet beneath them there is a softer presence, harder to name and easier to ignore. Churches stand where older stones once stood. Fields are shaped by hands no one remembers. Footpaths follow lines that were not drawn by medieval surveyors, but by generations who walked the same routes long before anyone thought to write them down. History, as we are taught it, moves like a straight road. It starts somewhere distant, passes through famous moments, and arrives at the present as if nothing important happened between those points unless someone recorded it. But the land does not move in straight lines. It folds, it layers, it remembers in curves and shadows. What we call history may only be the thin, visible skin of something thicker, deeper, and far older. There is a strange feeling that comes when you stand in a quiet place and sense that it has been quiet before. Not empty, not untouched, but silent in the way a room becomes silent after a conversation ends. The silence is not nothing. It is what remains. Britain is full of this kind of silence. It rests in valleys, in ruined walls, in the spaces between recorded events. It waits where questions used to be. Perhaps that is why so many old places feel meaningful even when we no longer know why. A hill is called sacred without explanation. A spring is protected without memory. A stone circle is visited without understanding. These places hold a weight that has outlived its language. Something was once said here that no longer has words. We are taught to trust what is written. We rarely ask what had to be forgotten for writing to begin. We inherit timelines that feel clean and confident, yet they depend on what they leave out. A story that is too smooth often hides its roughest edges beneath the surface. Absence becomes easier to accept than uncertainty. But absence can also be a signal. When something is missing everywhere, its absence starts to feel deliberate. When a land is clearly shaped by human care, yet no people are remembered for shaping it, a quiet question forms. Who was here before the names arrived? Who walked these paths before they were given titles? Who lived in this place before it learned how to explain itself? The past does not vanish all at once. It fades like breath on cold air. It thins as stories change, as rituals lose meaning, as symbols turn into decorations. What was once central becomes background. What was once lived becomes observed. What was once remembered becomes merely felt. And yet, the feeling remains. That is where this story begins. Not with evidence, not with claims, not with conclusions, but with a sensation. A sense that something once mattered here in a way we no longer understand. A sense that what we call medieval Britain is not the foundation, but the surface. A sense that the land is holding something we have not been taught to look for. If something meaningful once existed and was slowly forgotten, then forgetting itself becomes the mystery. Not what was lost, but how it could disappear so gently that no one noticed it leaving. And from that quiet question, a deeper one begins to form. How does a civilization fade without falling, and what does it leave behind when it goes? A civilization does not always end the way stories expect it to end. It does not always burn. It does not always fall. It does not always announce its last breath with noise or violence. Sometimes it simply becomes something else, quietly enough that no one notices the change while it is happening. We tend to imagine endings as events, because events are easy to see. A battle can be dated. A fire leaves ash. A collapse leaves ruins. But fading leaves almost nothing behind. It leaves continuity instead of contrast. It leaves familiarity instead of shock. It leaves no clear moment where one can say, this is where it stopped. A language changes one sound at a time. A word is pronounced slightly differently by one generation, then slightly differently again by the next. After a while, the word is new, but no one remembers when it changed. A ritual shifts its meaning. What was once sacred becomes seasonal. What was once a prayer becomes a celebration. What was once a story about the world becomes a story for children. Nothing is broken. Nothing is removed. Everything simply slides into a softer shape. Sacred places do not vanish either. They are reused. A hill remains a hill. A spring remains a spring. A clearing remains a clearing. Only the reason people gather there changes. The old purpose fades into the background while a new one takes its place. The place itself never notices the difference. This is how erasure can be gentle. It does not push things away. It covers them with new meaning. It does not remove memory. It reframes it. Over time, the old explanation becomes unnecessary. The new explanation becomes obvious, and the question that once mattered slowly stops being asked. A civilization can disappear in exactly this way, not by being defeated, but by being absorbed. Its people do not leave. They stay. They marry. They work. They raise children. Their language bends toward the new one spoken around them. Their customs blend with the new ones practiced beside them. Their stories are retold using different names. Their values survive without their original frame. Eventually, the culture is no longer visible as a separate thing. It has become the background. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. From the inside, everything slowly changed. This is what makes forgetting so effective. It feels like continuity. It feels like progress. It feels like the natural flow of time doing what time always does. There is no villain to blame. No moment to grieve. No loss dramatic enough to be remembered as loss. And yet, something has still been lost. Not the people, not the land, not the practices, but the awareness that these things were once part of something else. What remains is a version without a name. This is why history can feel thinner than the world itself. Because history prefers moments of change, while reality often changes without moments. History remembers shifts. Reality often moves by drifting. When we look back and see a culture begin, we rarely ask what it was built from. When we see a tradition appear, we rarely ask what it replaced. When we see a story written down, we rarely ask what stories were told before writing arrived. We are taught to recognize beginnings, but not transformations. And so a civilization can fade without ever being destroyed. It can dissolve into the future and survive inside it. Its buildings become foundations. Its roots become roads. Its rituals become habits. Its worldview becomes instinct. Long after its name is forgotten, its shape remains. This is why the question is not whether something was lost, but whether we still know what we are standing on. If medieval Britain inherited land, knowledge, and structure from an earlier world, it would not look like theft. It would look like inheritance. And inheritance rarely feels mysterious. It feels deserved. It feels normal. It feels like the way things are supposed to be. Only when we look closely do we notice that what feels normal may once have been remarkable. And only when we notice that do we begin to sense that something quiet and meaningful has passed through this land, leaving traces without leaving a signature. Once that possibility exists, the world begins to look different. Not emptier, but fuller. Not simpler, but deeper. And from that depth, the story can begin to point, very gently, toward the places where forgetting may have happened, and where remembering might still be possible. The land speaks in shapes more than in names. It shows memory as curves and hollows, lines and rises that do not quite match the stories we tell about them. Walk across a field, and you may cross a boundary no map records. Step onto a hill and feel a purpose no sign explains. Yet the ground seems arranged with care long before our words arrived here, softly waiting still. These are not ruins exactly, not broken or fallen, but unfinished sentences in stone and soil. A bank of earth curves where no wall stands. A ring of stones rests where no story remains. A road bends toward a spring no town claims. These forms feel older than memory yet present enough to touch, as if the land kept notes for us to find when we were ready to notice. Imagine builders lifting stone that was already shaped by older hands. They do not ask who cut it. They trust its weight, its balance, its quiet strength. A church rises from a hill that once held something else. A path runs beside a river that guided travelers long before bridges arrived. The builders feel no theft, only usefulness, only continuity, only the sense that this place was waiting for them. Over time, the old reasons soften. The new reasons grow firm. The hill becomes holy again for different words. The spring becomes blessed again by another name. The circle becomes curious instead of sacred. The meaning changes, but the gathering remains. The land does not object. It accepts each layer like a new season covering the last, without erasing its shape beneath the soil and grass and time that passes. Walk long enough and you begin to sense order where none is named. A road aligns with sunrise at one point and sunset at another. A circle rests where sound carries strangely across water. A hill faces another hill, across a valley like mirrors watching each other. These are not accidents exactly, but they are not instructions either. They feel like decisions made slowly over many lives, choosing places that felt right. The effect is gentle discovery, not shock. You do not uncover a city beneath a city. You feel a pattern beneath a pattern. You sense that what you walk on was once arranged with thought, with care, with meaning that did not require writing to survive. The land itself became the record holding alignment and memory, long after voices faded into silence, and names slipped away from use and need. This is why the clues do not shout. They whisper through placement, through repetition, through the feeling that something fits too well to be chance. Stones rest where they steady best. Paths run where feet choose easiest. Hills face where light falls softest. The choices are practical and poetic at once, shaped by hands, guided by senses, listening to wind and water and sun and shade until the land agreed. When we notice this, we begin to feel small, not unimportant but brief. The land has been arranging itself with us and without us for a very long time. Our stories are recent. Our borders are thin. Our explanations are light, compared to the weight of stone and soil and water that hold memory without words and order without law, and meaning without record except presence and pattern and use. This is the first hint. Not that something is hidden, but that something is layered. The past is not behind us. It is under us, supporting us, shaping us while we walk above it unaware. The land remembers because it cannot forget. It holds every choice, every path, every gathering, every change, and offers them back as shape and line and place, waiting for eyes that are ready to see. From here, the story can turn toward people, toward hands and voices that made these choices. The land shows us that something organized once existed quietly, carefully, without monuments or crowns. It asks only that we notice, that we listen, and then wonder who lived within this order and why their names did not travel with it into our books and songs and maps and tales we tell at night. Britain did not begin when the Romans arrived, and it did not awaken when the Saxons followed. By the time those names entered the land had already been lived in, shaped, tended, and known for thousands of quiet years. Fields had been cleared. Paths had been walked into permanence. Hills had been named and renamed, and then forgotten again, their meanings held only in the way people moved around them. Before written history, there was living history. Before dates, there were seasons. Before records, there were routines. People woke, worked, rested, gathered, celebrated, mourned, and dreamed in this place, long before anyone thought to describe it in ink. They planted crops in patterns that matched the soil. They followed animals along familiar routes. They built shelters where wind was gentle and water was close. They learned the land not as a resource, but as a companion. They were not scattered wanderers. They were organized in ways that did not require crowns or borders. Families formed communities. Communities formed networks. Trade moved across valleys and coasts, carrying stone, salt, grain, and stories from one place to another. Knowledge traveled with people. Skills passed through hands. Memory passed through voices. Spiritual life was woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Certain places were returned to again and again, not because a law demanded it, but because something there felt right. A hill offered a wide view. A spring offered clear water. A grove offered shade and stillness. These places became familiar not through command, but through care. Over generations, these patterns became culture, but lived culture. It shaped how people saw time, how they treated the land, how they understood birth and death and change. It did not need names to exist. It did not need monuments to endure. It survived by being practiced. And yet, when we look back through history, we rarely see these people clearly. We see their tools in museums. We see their bones in the ground. We see their shapes in the landscape. But we rarely see them as a whole world. They appear as fragments, as prefaces, as something before something else. The story often begins when Rome arrives, as if arrival itself were creation. It continues when Saxons settle, as if settlement were awakening. What came before is treated as a blur, a background, a long silence waiting to be filled. But it was not silent. It was speaking a language we no longer use. The people who lived here before history began counting did not think of themselves as before anything. They were not early, they were not primitive, they were present. They were complete within their own time. Their lives were not leading toward Rome or pointing toward medieval kingdoms. Their lives were their own. They knew the rhythms of their world with an intimacy that writing cannot replace. They watched stars move. They felt seasons shift. They noticed when birds arrived and when they left. They sensed changes in wind, in light, in water, and learned to adjust themselves with care. This way of living leaves fewer traces than conquest. It leaves no grand ruins, no towering walls, no declarations of power. It leaves balance instead of dominance. It leaves continuity instead of interruption. It leaves memory without monuments. That may be why these people feel difficult to see from the present. Our histories are trained to look for change, for drama, for events that interrupt. We are less trained to look for what continues. Once we begin to sense this, the quiet tension grows. If such people lived here, loved here, worked here, shaped this land, and were shaped by it in return, why do they feel like a shadow instead of a story right now? How does a world become invisible without ever being destroyed? Not all cultures are remembered in the same way, and not all stories survive with equal strength. Memory does not move through time on its own. It is carried, it is chosen. It is shaped by the hands that hold it and the voices that repeat it, and sometimes by the hands that decide to let it go. History often feels solid because it is written. Ink fixes moments in place. Stone seals them into form. A written record becomes an anchor that resists forgetting. But before writing, memory lived in people. It lived in voices, in gestures, in repeated actions and shared songs. It lived as something living, not stored. And living things are fragile in a different way. When one culture replaces another, the new culture does not arrive into empty space. It arrives into a world already filled with meaning. It finds names for things that already have names. It tells stories about places that already have stories. It builds on ground that has already been walked. In doing so, it does not always erase what came before. It often covers it with a new layer of explanation. This covering is not always cruel. Often it is practical. It is easier to use what already exists than to remove it. It is easier to adapt than to destroy. A sacred place becomes sacred again, but for a different reason. A festival survives, but with a new story attached. A path remains, but now it leads somewhere else. Over time, the old meaning fades into the background. The new meaning becomes visible. What remains feels natural. What was replaced feels unnecessary to remember. This is how forgetting becomes gentle. It does not feel like loss. It feels like simplification. Power plays a role, but not always as force. Power also works through language, through education, through which stories are taught to children and which are not. The stories that support identity, unity, and continuity are repeated. The stories that complicate, unsettle, or question are softened or allowed to drift away. Written culture tends to outlast spoken culture because it does not depend on people being present. A book can wait for a reader. A story needs a voice. When voices disappear, stories can disappear with them. This does not require intention. It does not require a plan. It happens naturally when one way of remembering becomes easier than another. And so history becomes a lens rather than a mirror. It does not reflect everything. It filters. It focuses. It distorts. It magnifies some things and reduces others. It brings certain shapes into clarity and leaves others blurred at the edges. This does not make history false. It makes it partial. The danger is not that history lies, but that it feels complete. When a culture disappears from memory, it is often because it did not fit neatly into the story that followed it. It did not align with the values that became dominant. It did not support the narrative that was needed. So it was not written. Or it was written differently. Or it was written only as a footnote, a preface, a vague before. And after a while, even that fades. This is why disappearance is not only a mystery, it is also a choice. Not always a conscious one, not always a cruel one, but a human one. A choice to remember what feels useful, meaningful, or comforting, and to forget what feels complicated, unclear, or unnecessary. We do this in our own lives as well. We remember stories that help us understand who we are. We forget stories that make that understanding feel uncertain. Cultures do the same. Once we understand this, forgetting stops being strange. It becomes familiar. And once forgetting feels familiar, remembering becomes possible again. Not as recovery, not as rescue, not as correction, but as listening. Because something was not destroyed does not mean it was not lost. And something that was lost does not mean it cannot still be felt. With this understanding, the story can begin to turn gently toward what remains, and what might still be waiting beneath the surface, quiet and patient, ready to be noticed again. It is possible that the civilization beneath medieval Britain did not look like what we usually call a civilization at all. It may not have built palaces or crowned rulers or raised banners above its towns. It may not have carved its story into stone or pressed it into clay or written it onto parchment. It may have had no single center, no capital, no voice that spoke for everyone at once. And yet, it may have been powerful. Power does not always appear as command. It can appear as coherence. It can appear as stability, as continuity, as a way of living that lasts because it works. A society does not need kings to organize itself. It does not need borders to understand where it belongs. It does not need laws carved into walls to know how to live together. It can grow instead through shared habits, shared values, and shared understanding. It can form through the way people treat one another, the way they care for children and elders, the way they respond to conflict, the way they decide what matters and what does not. Such a civilization would not leave behind the kinds of marks that history is trained to recognize. It would leave no great towers to fall, no famous battles to be recorded, no names large enough to survive the thinning of time. It would leave something quieter. It would leave patterns. It would leave ways of moving through land without harming it, ways of gathering without excluding, ways of believing without conquering, ways of teaching without writing. These things are harder to see from a distance. They do not survive well in books. They survive in people. This is why such a civilization could be absorbed rather than destroyed. When new cultures arrived, there may have been no clear boundary to cross, no enemy to defeat, no city to take. There may have only been people living in a way that could be joined rather than overthrown. Over time, languages changed, names changed, stories were told in new forms, but the deeper shapes remained. The rhythms of life, the sense of time, the feeling for place, the respect for certain hills and springs and paths, the way community was held together, the way meaning was found in cycles rather than in conquest. These things do not disappear easily. They are not stored in buildings. They are stored in behavior. This is the first quiet reveal. That influence does not require visibility. That legacy does not require monuments. That a civilization can shape the future most deeply by becoming part of it. What we often call disappearance may actually be success. A culture that leaves no ruins may be one that did not need to separate itself from the land. A culture that leaves no name may be one that did not need to declare itself. A culture that leaves no record may be one that trusted continuity more than memory. This kind of civilization does not ask to be remembered. It asks to be lived. And so it lives on, invisibly. It lives on in how villages gather around greens instead of around thrones. It lives on in how paths curve around hills instead of cutting through them. It lives on in seasonal rhythms that still shape festivals, food, and feeling long after their origins have been forgotten. It lives on in myths that speak of older beings, older builders, older teachers whose names are lost but whose presence remains. It lives on in the way Britain feels. There is a gentleness to the land that does not match the stories of invasion and empire alone. There is a softness beneath the stone, a patience beneath the roads, a sense that the island learned long ago how to hold people without needing to rule them. This does not mean that later empires did not arrive. They did. They brought new structures, new powers, new conflicts, new ambitions. But they did not arrive into emptiness. They arrived into something already shaped, already meaningful, already alive. They built on it. And by building on it, they carried it forward. So the civilization beneath medieval Britain may not be something to find like a ruin or a relic. It may be something to notice in the way things still work when no one is watching. In the way land and people still move together. In the way meaning still grows quietly without needing permission. This is why the most influential civilization may be the one you have never heard of. Not because it was small, but because it was everywhere, and because it chose not to stand apart from what came next. From here, the story can begin to follow its traces, not through evidence, but through echoes, through stories, through rituals, through shapes that feel older than their names, and meanings that feel deeper than their words. That is where its memory still waits. Some stories do not feel like inventions. They feel like survivals. They carry a weight that is heavier than entertainment and quieter than history. They arrive already aged, already worn smooth by repetition, already carrying the sense that they have been told before they were ever written down. These are the stories that do not quite belong to the world that tells them. In Britain, they appear as giants who shaped hills, as hidden people who live beneath the ground, as ancient builders who placed stones no one remembers lifting, as unnamed beings who taught humans how to live before kings, ruled and borders existed. These figures appear again and again, in different places, with different names, but with the same quiet roles. They are always older than humanity. They are always wiser than rulers. They are always closer to the land than to power. They do not behave like gods. They do not demand worship. They do not rule from above. They move sideways through stories, half present, half absent, appearing when something needs to be explained, and fading when explanation becomes uncomfortable. They feel like memory that has lost its language. A myth is not a lie. It is a shape. It is meaning that has survived without its original frame. It is a story that has been retold so many times that its purpose has shifted, but its presence remains. Like a fossil, it preserves form without function, outline without origin. When people speak of giants building stones, they are not describing height. They are describing importance. When they speak of ancient teachers, they are not describing magic. They are describing inheritance. When they speak of those who came before, they are not describing creatures. They are describing ancestors who no longer have names. This is why these stories feel strangely detached from medieval life. They do not reflect castles or crowns or laws or wars. They reflect something older, slower, closer to land and season and repetition. They reflect a world that did not measure itself by conquest or time, but by continuity. The medieval world did not create these stories. It received them. It carried them forward because they felt meaningful, even when they no longer made sense. It kept them alive because something in them still resonated, still warned, still comforted, still explained in a way that no new story could replace. This is why myths often feel out of place. They are not wrong. They are displaced. They speak of a world that no longer exists in its original form, but still exists in its influence. They are the emotional archaeology of a civilization that left no written record, no official name, no surviving voice. So it speaks through symbols. The land becomes a character. The builders become giants. The teachers become hidden folk. The ancestors become those who came before. The memory becomes a story. This is not deception. It is survival. A story that loses its context does not disappear. It adapts. It becomes portable. It becomes memorable. It becomes strange enough to stay alive. And so these myths continue, not because they are believed, but because they are felt. People do not tell them to explain the world. They tell them to express something about it that explanation cannot reach. They tell them because they feel old. They feel older than the words used to tell them. This is why so many old stories insist that someone else was here first. Not because they want to frighten, but because they remember. They carry a sense of precedence, of inheritance, of something that shaped the present before the present understood itself. They are reminders that the world we walk in was not built only by those whose names we know. It was built by hands we no longer see, by lives we no longer trace, by choices we still live inside. And so, the myths remain, quietly, patiently, like stones beneath grass. They do not argue. They do not demand. They wait. They wait for someone to notice that they feel older than the words used to tell them. From here, the story can begin to look more closely at the figures that appear within these myths, not as fantasies, but as patterns, and to ask what kind of people might be remembered this way, and why their memory chose symbols instead of names. That is where the echoes begin to take shape. Across Britain, the same figures appear again and again, wearing different names like different coats. In one valley they are called giants, in another they are hidden folk. Somewhere else they are ancient teachers, old builders, first people, watchers, shapers, bringers. Their forms shift, but their roles remain strangely consistent. They are always described as arriving before everyone else, always linked to the land itself, always responsible for something important already being there. They raise stones, shape hills, lay out paths, and teach humans how to live, how to build, how to plant, how to see. Then they disappear. It is tempting to take these stories literally, and just as tempting to dismiss them completely. But there is another way to listen to them. Not as fact, and not as fiction, but as memory translated into symbol. A giant does not have to be tall to be called large. Large can mean important. Large can mean foundational. Large can mean so influential that later generations feel small beside it, not in body, but in depth of belonging. When people say giants built the stones, they may be saying something quieter and more honest, that the builders felt greater than those who came after them, because they understood the land more deeply and lived within it more fully. The ancient teachers do not arrive with books or rules. They arrive with ways of doing things. They show people how to grow food, how to use tools, how to live together, how to understand time and season. This is not magic. This is culture being born and remembered as gift. The hidden races do not hide because they are small. They hide because they have been absorbed. They hide because they are no longer separate enough to be seen. They hide because they have become part of the background. The first people are not first in time alone, but first in relationship. The ones who learned the land before the land learned our names. When these figures are placed side by side, a pattern begins to form. They are not random characters. They are fragments of the same memory, told through different voices, shaped by different imaginations, carried forward by different communities. They are the remembered shape of a civilization that had no story of itself, only stories left about it. This is why the details change while the structure stays the same. One place says giants, another says fair folk, another says ancient builders, another says wise ones who came before, but they all point in the same direction. Something was here. Something shaped this place. Something taught, built, organized, and then faded into the background of the world it helped create. Folklore is not precise because memory is not precise. It is emotional. It preserves importance, not accuracy. It remembers what mattered, not what exactly happened. And what mattered, it seems, was not the names of these people, but their role. They mattered because they made the world livable, because they created order without dominance, because they built without conquering, because they taught without ruling. They mattered enough to be remembered, but not in the way empires are remembered. Empires leave behind texts, laws, ruins, and borders. Living cultures leave behind habits, paths, values, and rhythms. When the texts vanish, the habits remain. When the borders fall, the rhythms continue. When the ruins are covered, the paths still curve the same way through the land. So these figures remain not as proof, but as presence. They appear in stories, because stories are where meaning goes when it has nowhere else to live, and because meaning does not like to disappear. This is why these archetypes repeat, not because imagination is lazy, but because memory is faithful. It holds on to what mattered most, and lets the rest blur. The builders mattered. The teachers mattered. The ones who came before mattered. So they remain, not as people, but as patterns, not as history, but as echo, not as evidence, but as invitation. And once that pattern is felt, the story can begin to look for it elsewhere, not in words, but in stone, in soil, in shape, in place. Because if these figures are memory, then the land itself may be the archive, and that is where their traces may still be waiting. Some places do not let go of their meaning, even when the stories around them change. Long after names are replaced and rituals are reworded, certain hills still draw people upward, certain springs still invite hands to touch their water, Certain paths still pull feet along them without explanation. These places feel older than their labels. They feel settled into a purpose that does not depend on what we call it. A hill does not care if it is named sacred, holy, blessed, or special. It only knows that people have come to it again and again, bringing attention, intention, stillness, or gratitude. Over time, that attention becomes part of the place. The land learns it, the shape holds it. The meaning sinks into soil and stone, until it becomes a kind of atmosphere that can be felt but not easily described. This is why so many sacred places seem to outlast the beliefs that claim them. A church rises on a hill where something else once stood. A shrine is built beside a spring that was honored long before the shrine existed. A pilgrimage follows a route that was walked before anyone thought of pilgrimage as a word. The forms change. The gathering remains. Sacredness is rarely invented. It is inherited. People do not choose sacred places at random. They return to places that already feel different. They build where others once paused. They pray where others once listened. They sing where others once stood in silence. Each generation believes it is choosing the place, but the place has been choosing people for a very long time. This is how meaning survives change. It does not travel in books alone. It travels in habit. It travels in feet and hands and breath. It travels in the way people slow down in certain places without knowing why, in the way voices soften, in the way time feels different. The medieval world did not erase these places. It accepted them. It adopted them. It built its structures on top of them like new words layered over old thoughts. The land did not object. It continued to hold what it had always held. And so medieval Britain did not replace the old world. It rested on it. This is the quiet reveal hidden in the landscape. Not that something was taken away, but that something was carried forward. The past did not vanish. It settled beneath the present, like a deeper current beneath a visible river. When we look at these places now, we see only the top layer. We see the church, the shrine, the marker, the sign. But beneath that layer is another story, and beneath that another, and beneath that another still. The land is not a page. It is a stack of pages, pressed together so tightly that they feel like one. This is why sacred places feel heavy with time. Not because they are old, but because they are layered. They have held many meanings without losing their own. And so the question is not why medieval people chose these places, but why these places had already been chosen. Why do the holiest places always seem older than the faith that claims them? Because faith does not create meaning. It names it. The land holds memory in a way people cannot. It does not forget, because forgetting is a human act. The land does not move on. It waits. It allows change to pass through it, but it does not release what it has already held. This is why returning to certain places can feel like remembering something you never learned. The body recognizes what the mind does not. The feet slow, the breath deepens. The world feels quieter without becoming empty. These reactions are not spiritual in the sense of belief. They are relational. They are responses to places that have been lived with attention for a very long time. And that attention accumulates. It becomes a kind of gravity. This is how a civilization can survive without being seen. It does not survive as name or record or monument. It survives as pattern, as habit, as feeling, as the invisible structure of where people gather, where they pause, where they sense that something matters, even when they cannot say what. From here, the story can move away from places and toward what was carried through them. Not only sacredness, but knowledge. Not only memory, but method. Not only meaning, but ways of living that still shape the present quietly from beneath. That is where the next layer begins to appear. Some knowledge does not arrive with a beginning. It simply appears already in use, already refined, already woven into daily life, as if it had always been there. No one remembers when it started. No one remembers who first shaped it. It does not announce itself as invention. It presents itself as normal. In medieval Britain, many skills appear in this quiet way. Stone is cut with precision that suggests long practice. Fields are arranged in patterns that match soil, slope, and drainage, with remarkable sensitivity. Ships move along coasts and rivers, guided by an understanding of tide and wind that feels learned through generations, rather than discovered in a moment. Time itself is kept not only by clocks, but by seasons, light, harvest, and ritual. These things do not look new when they appear in history. They look mature. A technique that is young often feels clumsy. It shows signs of trial, error, adjustment, but these skills arrive already smooth. They fit their environment too well to be accidental. They feel like the end of a long conversation, rather than the beginning of one. This suggests that much of what medieval Britain practiced was not invented in medieval Britain. It was inherited. Not through books, not through proclamations, but through hands. A child watches how stone is lifted and set. A young farmer learns when to plant by watching when others plant. A sailor feels the rhythm of water before understanding its logic. Knowledge moves through bodies before it ever moves through language. This kind of knowledge does not need to be named to survive. It only needs to be useful. And so, it survives without credit. No one writes down the name of the first person who noticed how water drains from a hill. No one records who first aligned a wall to block wind. No one remembers who first learned how to follow birds to land. These discoveries become collective before they become historical. They dissolve into practice. By the time writing arrives, the knowledge has already become invisible. This is why it feels originless. Not because it has no origin, but because its origin is no longer separate from its use. We often imagine knowledge as something created by individuals, but much knowledge is created by communities over time. It forms through repetition, correction, observation, and care. It grows slowly, like soil, shaped by countless small choices that no single person owns. A wall stands because many hands learned what holds and what falls. A calendar exists because many lives noticed when light changes, and crops grow, and animals move. A path remains because many feet found it easier than others. This is not invention, it is cultivation. And cultivation leaves no signature. This is how knowledge can survive, even when the culture that formed it fades from memory. The knowledge does not belong to that culture anymore. It belongs to whoever needs it next. So when medieval builders cut stone with inherited precision, they were not borrowing, they were continuing. When medieval farmers planted in inherited rhythms, they were not copying, they were remembering without knowing that they were remembering. When medieval sailors followed inherited routes, they were not repeating, they were trusting a world that had already been learned by others. This is what it means to inherit knowledge, without inheriting the name of its creator. The knowledge arrives without history. It feels native. It feels obvious. It feels like the way things are supposed to be. And that is the most effective way for knowledge to survive. It does not stand out. It blends in. It does not announce itself as old. It feels timeless. It does not demand recognition. It becomes background. This is why it is so hard to notice. We do not question what works. We question what fails. We do not investigate what feels natural. We investigate what feels strange. So the most enduring knowledge becomes the least visible. It hides inside habit. It hides inside tradition. It hides inside the way things are done without explanation. And yet, if we slow down enough to look, we can sense that much of what we consider medieval is older than medieval. Much of what we consider local is older than locality. Much of what we consider obvious is older than understanding. This does not make the medieval world less impressive. It makes it more connected. It becomes not a beginning, but a bridge. And once we see that, the story can begin to move from what people did to what people believed, from practical inheritance to symbolic inheritance, from skills that shaped the world to meanings that shaped how the world was seen. That is where the next layer waits. Time does not only move forward, it also moves around. Long before clocks divided days into numbers and calendars stacked months into rows, time was felt as a rhythm, a breathing pattern of light and dark, growth and rest, warmth and cold. In this way of living, time was not something to measure, but something to follow. In Britain, this older sense of time still shapes life quietly. Planting does not begin because a date says so, but because the ground feels ready. Harvest does not arrive because a number appears on a page, but because the fields turn gold. Celebrations rise when darkness deepens, or light returns, not because a rule demands it, but because something in people responds. These patterns feel natural, but they are learned, they are inherited. Seasonal festivals still fall, where older rituals once rested. Midwinter remains a moment of pause and reflection. Midsummer still carries a sense of fullness and openness. Spring is still linked to renewal. Autumn is still linked to release. The names change, the meanings shift, the timing remains. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. A culture that lives within cycles does not see time as a ladder to climb. It sees time as a wheel to move with. Each return is not repetition, but renewal. Each ending is not loss, but transition. Nothing is meant to be permanent. Nothing is meant to disappear. Everything is meant to change and then change again. This way of seeing the world leaves a deep impression. It teaches patience. It teaches attention. It teaches that meaning is found not in speed but in timing. And this way of seeing does not vanish easily. Even when societies begin to speak in terms of progress, achievement, and growth, they still live inside cycles they did not choose. They still depend on seasons they cannot control. They still feel drawn to certain moments in the year without always knowing why. A holiday arrives, and people feel something even when they do not know what they are feeling. A season changes and moods shift without explanation. Light returns and spirits lift. Darkness deepens, and people turn inward. These reactions are not taught, they are remembered. They are the body's way of keeping an older calendar. This is why the idea of a forgotten civilization does not feel distant. It feels present. Its influence is not in ruins or artifacts, but in rhythm. It lives in when people gather, when they rest, when they celebrate, when they mourn. It lives in the invisible structure of daily life. We rarely question this structure because it feels like nature, but it is also culture. It is a way of relating to time that was shaped by people who lived closer to land, weather, and change than we do now. They did not divide life into hours. They divided it into phases. They did not chase the future. They returned to what had come before. This does not mean they were simple. It means they were attentive. They noticed when birds arrived and when they left. They noticed when water rose and when it fell. They noticed when light lingered and when it disappeared early. Over time, these observations became shared knowledge. Shared knowledge became ritual. Ritual became tradition. Tradition became background. And the background is what lasts. So when we mark time now, we are not only using a calendar. We are stepping into a pattern that has been practiced for thousands of years. We are participating in a rhythm that has outlived its original language. We think we are choosing when to celebrate, when to pause, when to begin, when to end. But often we are responding to something older than choice. This is how a civilization can continue without being named. It does not need to speak. It does not need to appear. It only needs to keep time. And as long as people still feel the pull of seasons, the shift of light, the return of certain moods and moments, that civilization is still shaping life from beneath the surface. From here, the story can begin to turn inward. If time itself is inherited, then so is the way people understand themselves within it. Identity is not only personal or social, it is temporal. It is shaped by when and how people believe they belong. That is where the next layer begins to reveal itself. At some point, the question stops being where the civilization went and becomes where it is now. Not in ruins, not in records, not in names, but in people. The quiet possibility begins to form that nothing vanished at all. It simply changed its shape. The people of the older world did not leave this land. They did not walk away into legend. They stayed. They grew old. They raised children. They passed on habits, not histories. They passed on ways of doing things, not explanations for why those ways existed. Over generations, their language bent into new sounds, their stories took new forms, their customs shifted into new meanings, but their presence did not disappear. It dissolved into what came next. This is how a civilization becomes invisible. It does not end. It becomes background. Its people become ancestors rather than characters. Their influence becomes instinct rather than memory. Their world becomes foundation rather than story. And foundations are rarely noticed once a building stands. We tend to imagine disappearance as absence, but this kind of disappearance is saturation. The culture did not leave a gap. It filled the future so completely that it could no longer be seen as separate from it. Its success became its erasure. If a civilization fails, it leaves ruins. If it succeeds, it leaves continuity. The medieval world did not replace the old world. It grew out of it. It layered itself on top of it, carried forward by people who no longer thought of themselves as belonging to anything other than their present. The past did not vanish. It became the shape of the present. This is why it is so hard to point to the forgotten civilization and say, there it is. There is no border where it stops and something else begins. There is no line where one people end and another appear. There is only flow. We search for beginnings because we want clarity. We want moments we can circle on a page and call origin. But real origins are rarely dramatic. They are gradual. They grow like forests, not like towers. They spread quietly until they become the environment rather than the event. This is what happened here. The forgotten civilization did not disappear into nothing. It disappeared into everything. It became the way villages formed rather than the names of the villages. It became the way land was respected rather than the words used to describe that respect. It became the rhythm of work and rest rather than the calendar that marked it. It became the feeling of belonging to a place rather than the story of how that belonging began. It became us. And when something becomes us, we stop seeing it. We stop asking where it came from because it feels like where we come from. This is the quiet, emotional turn at the heart of the story. The civilization is not hidden somewhere beneath our feet. It is moving through our lives every day. It is present in what feels normal, in what feels natural, in what feels like the way things are supposed to be. Its disappearance is not a tragedy. It is a transformation. But transformation still carries loss. Not the loss of people, but the loss of awareness. The loss of knowing that what we are living inside was shaped by hands long gone. The loss of remembering that the world we inherit was once carefully made, not given, not accidental. When that awareness fades, gratitude fades with it. We stop seeing the land as relationship and begin seeing it as resource. We stop seeing time as rhythm and begin seeing it as pressure. We stop seeing community as inheritance and begin seeing it as construction. The forgotten civilization did not disappear, but the way of seeing that created it is fragile. That is what is truly at risk. And that is what this story is quietly trying to notice again. Not to restore it, not to revive it, not to return to it, but to recognize that it is still here, shaping the present from beneath it, and that recognizing it changes how we stand in the world. If they became us, then the story is not about what was lost. It is about what we are still carrying, and what we might choose to carry forward. With this understanding, the mystery does not close. It softens. It becomes less about discovery and more about responsibility. Less about what happened then and more about what happens now. From here, the story is ready to turn toward the present world and ask what this invisible inheritance means for who we believe ourselves to be, and how we choose to live inside the long story we did not begin, but now continue. Some roads do not seem to belong to the maps that claim them. They run past towns without entering them, curve around castles instead of toward them, and cross borders without noticing that borders exist. They feel older than the lines drawn to explain them, older than the names given to the places they pass through, and older even than the idea that roads are meant to go somewhere specific. These paths do not behave like plans. They behave like habits. They wind through hills where the walking is easiest, dip towards springs where water waits, follow ridges where the ground stays dry, and slip through valleys where wind softens and light opens. They connect not power to power, but place to place. A hill to a river, a clearing to a grove, a spring to a crossing. Their logic is not political. It is physical. It is relational. Walk one of these old paths, and it does not feel like travel. It feels like returning. The body seems to know where to go before the mind decides. The turns feel right. The rises feel expected. The pauses appear where rest is natural. It is as if the land itself is guiding movement, and the path is simply the record of that guidance made visible through repetition. This is why these roads do not line up with medieval planning or Roman order. Those systems were imposed from above. These paths were learned from below. A ruler draws a straight line. A walker finds a gentle one. A surveyor divides space. A traveller follows comfort. A map measures distance. A path measures ease. Over time, ease becomes preference. Preference becomes repetition. Repetition becomes route. Route becomes road. And the road remains long after the reason for it is forgotten. This is what gives these paths their strange persistence. They are not held in place by stone or law, but by usefulness. They survive because they still work. They still feel right to walk. So even when towns shift, even when borders change, even when names are replaced, the paths remain. They ignore new centers of power because they were never built for power. They were built for people. They lead not to capitals, but to gatherings. Not to thrones, but to water. Not to fortresses, but to fields. Not to authority, but to life. This suggests something quiet and important, that the land was organized long before it was ruled, that movement existed before control, and that connection existed before command. The old paths reveal a world structured by relationship rather than hierarchy. They show a network without a center, a system without a crown, and a design without a designer. They imply a civilization that did not impose itself on the land, but listened to it, allowing hills to decide where to walk, rivers to decide where to cross, and springs to decide where to pause. It was a civilization that learned the land slowly and patiently through living inside it. This is why these roads feel like muscle memory. They are not remembered by the mind, but by the body of the land and the bodies that move through it. They are grooves worn into the world by trust. Trust that the path will lead somewhere meaningful, even if no one remembers what that meaning once was. Trust that the land knows where it is going, and trust that movement itself is a form of knowing. This is what makes these roads so unsettling and so comforting at the same time. They do not fit the stories we tell about order, yet they feel more ordered than many of the things we build on purpose. They are quiet systems that work without explanation. They remind us that not all intelligence speaks, not all planning is visible, not all organization needs authority, and not all maps are drawn on paper. Some maps are drawn in footsteps, some are drawn in habit, some are drawn in memory so old it no longer feels like memory at all. It feels like the shape of the world. And once we begin to notice these paths not as leftovers, but as expressions of a different logic, we can begin to sense that they are not random. They are part of a larger pattern, a network of meaning written into the land itself. From here, the story can move from individual roads to the invisible map they form together, and toward the deeper question of what kind of world needs a map that no one ever writes down. That is where the next layer quietly waits. When the land is viewed not as a collection of separate places but as a whole, something subtle begins to appear. Hills, springs, stone circles, old crossings, and gathering places do not seem scattered at random. They begin to feel arranged not by force or by a central plan, but by relationship. A hill faces another hill across a valley, a spring sits where paths naturally meet, and a circle rests where light and sound behave differently. These patterns do not announce themselves, but once they are noticed, they become difficult to ignore. It is tempting to explain this as coincidence, and it is just as tempting to insist it must be deliberate. But the order that appears in the land may not come from intention in the way we usually understand intention. It may come from sensitivity repeated over time. When many people make choices based on what feels right, what works well, and what fits the land instead of fighting it, those choices begin to align. Not because they were coordinated, but because they were guided by the same environment and the same needs. The result is a kind of geometry that does not belong to rulers or architects. It belongs to attention. When people gather where water is clear, where sound carries gently, and where light arrives in a particular way, those places become nodes in a quiet network. Paths form between them, stories travel between them, and meaning moves between them. Over time, these connections shape the land as much as the land shapes the connections. This is not a map that can be held or drawn. It is a map that can only be felt. It does not use straight lines, but ease. It does not use borders, but flow. It does not point outward, but connects inward. Seen this way, the forgotten civilization may have organized space not by control but by coherence, allowing order to emerge rather than imposing it. This kind of organization leaves no center, no capital, and no hierarchy. It leaves only relationship. That is why it feels invisible to systems that expect power to sit in one place and radiate outward. This world does not radiate. It resonates. A hill resonates with another hill. A spring resonates with a path, and a clearing resonates with a gathering. The relationships are not vertical but lateral, not stacked but woven. This is why the geometry feels hidden. It is not meant to be seen from above, but lived within. Only when someone steps back and looks gently across the whole does the pattern appear, and even then it appears more as a feeling than as a diagram. It is sensed as balance, as symmetry, and as quiet alignment, as the sense that things are placed where they belong. This gives the landscape its strange calm, the feeling that nothing is in the wrong place even when nothing seems formally arranged. It suggests a worldview that trusted the land more than the plan, that believed meaning emerges through living rather than command, and that saw space not as territory to be claimed, but as relationship to be entered. In such a world, the most important question is not where the center is, but where the connection is. This is why old sites feel linked even when no road directly connects them, as if they are parts of a single conversation held across distance and time, between people and place, between need and response, between attention and form. This is not mystical, but practical in a deeper sense. It is how a system organizes itself when no one is trying to own it. It is resilient not because it is defended, but because it is useful. It does not need to be recorded, because it is remembered by being used. So when patterns are sensed in the landscape, nothing new is being discovered. What is happening is recognition. The map exists, but it is not written down. It is written in hills and paths and pauses, and in where people go when no one tells them where to go. Once that map is felt, the story can turn from how space was organized to how people were organized within it, from landscape to society, and from connection to community. That is where the next question quietly waits. When medieval power wanted to make itself visible, it built upward and outward by raising stone walls thick enough to resist fire, towers tall enough to watch the horizon, and gates heavy enough to control who entered and who remained outside. These fortifications were not only defensive structures, but public declarations of hierarchy, ownership, and authority over space. They announced where power lived and who controlled movement, land, and people. Yet beneath and before these structures, the landscape tells a different story. In the deeper layers of Britain's past, there is a noticeable absence of fortifications, borders, and watchtowers. There are no widespread rings of stone marking territorial edges, and no clear architectural signs of a society organized primarily around defense. Instead, there are open fields, shared paths, communal gathering places, and patterns of movement that suggest cooperation rather than containment. This absence does not indicate weakness or vulnerability, but a different form of social organization. A society that does not build walls is not one that ignores danger, but one that structures itself so that danger does not become central to its identity. Instead of investing in barriers, such a society invests in relationships, in shared rituals, and in continuity across generations. Social order is maintained not through coercion, but through mutual dependence, shared expectation, and inherited understanding. In this kind of world, authority does not descend from above, but emerges from within. People know where they belong because belonging is practiced rather than enforced. Norms are not imposed by law but sustained through habit, memory, and repeated interaction. Stability does not come from control, but from coordination. And resilience does not depend on hierarchy, but on flexibility. The land itself becomes part of this social structure. When communities organize their lives around hills, rivers, seasons, and resources, their coordination becomes ecological as well as social. The environment provides both constraint and guidance, shaping how people move, gather, and share. This produces cooperation not because it is commanded, but because it is necessary for survival and continuity. Such a civilization leaves few traces that resemble conventional power. It builds no monuments to itself, and leaves no ruins that declare dominance. Its structure exists in patterns of behavior rather than in architecture, in rhythms of life rather than in towers of stone. It is therefore difficult for later societies to recognize a civilization at all, because modern ideas of civilization rely on visibility, scale, and permanence. Yet this invisibility is not absence. It is integration. The society is not located in one place or embodied in one institution. It is distributed across relationships, across shared practices, and across the landscape itself. It lives not in buildings, but in ways of living. This explains how such a civilization could be absorbed without being destroyed. With no walls to fall, no capital to capture, and no crown to take, There was nothing to conquer in the traditional sense. The society flowed into what came next, its structures dissolving into the background of new cultural forms, while its values and patterns quietly persisted. This reframes what civilization means. It is not necessarily a system that dominates space or organizes power, but a pattern of relationships that sustains life. It is not defined by control, but by coherence. It is not made strong by walls, but by trust. Seen this way, the absence of castles is not evidence of simplicity, but evidence of a different social intelligence, one that prioritized connection over defense and continuity over conquest. This civilization did not stand above the world. It fit within it. And once this possibility is allowed, the story can begin to move from how people organize their space to how they organize their meaning, from social structure to inner worldview, and from visible forms to invisible values. That is where the next layer of the story begins. The forgotten civilization did not appear to understand the world as a ladder to climb, but as a circle to move within. Life was not imagined as a journey toward a final point of victory, salvation, or dominance, but as a continuous unfolding shaped by return, rhythm, and balance. Time was not a line stretching forward into an unknown future, but a cycle that carried the present gently back into itself through seasons, generations, and recurring patterns of change. This way of seeing the world created a fundamentally different emotional relationship to existence. Living in time meant participating in its movement rather than trying to escape it or outrun it. Growth was not measured by expansion, but by harmony. Success was not defined by accumulation, but by stability. The aim of life was not to arrive somewhere else, but to remain in right relationship with what already was. In such a worldview, the seasons were not obstacles to overcome, but teachers to attend to. Winter was not an enemy, but a period of rest. Summer was not an opportunity for conquest, but a moment of abundance that demanded care. Spring and autumn were not transitions to be rushed through, but thresholds that invited reflection and adjustment. Change was not feared because it was expected, and loss was not final because return was assumed. This worldview did not deny suffering or hardship, but it did not give them ultimate meaning either. Difficulty was understood as part of the rhythm, not a punishment or a failure. Storms passed. Crops failed. People aged. Children were born. Nothing stayed the same, and that was not a problem to solve, but a truth to live with. This stands in quiet contrast to the worldview that later came to dominate medieval Europe, which understood time as a forward-moving force and history as a path toward destiny. In that frame, the future mattered more than the present, progress mattered more than balance, and movement mattered more than stillness. Power became a way of controlling uncertainty, and conquest became a way of proving meaning. The older worldview did not require such proof. Meaning was not something to be built. It was something to be maintained. Order was not imposed. It was tended. Identity was not defined by what one achieved, but by how one participated. This created a sense of belonging that did not depend on dominance. A person belonged not because they conquered land, but because they cared for it. They belonged not because they won status, but because they held responsibility. They belonged because they were woven into a web of relationships that extended beyond themselves into the land, the seasons, the community, and the past. In this way, the civilization was not organized around power, but around reciprocity. What was taken was returned. What was received was shared. What was changed was balanced. This created a form of stability that did not rely on force, but on repetition, memory, and mutual dependence. Living in such a world would have felt emotionally different from living in a world driven by ambition and progress. It would have felt slower, not in pace, but in pressure. It would have felt grounded, not in place, but in purpose. It would have felt continuous rather than urgent, as if life were not rushing towards something, but unfolding around something. The future, in this sense, was not a destination to reach, but a return to enter. What had been would come again, not in the same form, but in the same rhythm. What had been learned would be remembered not because it was written down, but because it worked. This does not mean the civilization was static or resistant to change. It means it did not fear change. It did not see change as loss or threat, but as movement within a larger stability. It trusted that continuity did not require sameness, and that survival did not require dominance. This worldview made power unnecessary in the way later societies would come to understand power. It replaced control with coordination and replaced conquest with care. It shaped a world in which the most important work was not to build something new, but to preserve the conditions that allowed life to continue. And once this way of seeing is felt, the story can begin to move closer, from worldview to lived experience, from belief to behavior, and from the shape of the universe as imagined to the shape of daily life as practiced. That is where the next layer quietly begins. When the forgotten civilization is imagined not as a system but as people, it becomes closer and quieter at the same time. It stops being a theory and becomes a texture of daily life. It becomes mornings and evenings, voices and footsteps, hands working and resting, children growing into adults, and elders watching time move through faces they recognize. The mystery shifts from what they built to how they lived. A day may have begun not with alarms or schedules, but with light and sound. People rose when the world rose. Work followed the rhythm of the land rather than the demand of a clock. Tasks were shared because survival was shared. Food was prepared not only to nourish, but to gather. Eating was not a pause from life, but a form of life itself, a moment when people reconnected with one another and with the world that sustained them. Children grew within a web of attention rather than under a single authority. They learned by watching, listening, copying, and participating. Knowledge was not delivered as instruction but absorbed through presence. A child learned how to treat the land by seeing how others treated it. A child learned how to speak by listening to stories. A child learned how to belong by being included. Elders were not set apart from daily life, but woven into it. They carried memory not as archive but as experience. Their value did not come from command, but from continuity. They were living bridges between past and present, not because they recited history, but because they embodied it. Care was not an institution, it was a habit. Love was not isolated into private space. It was expressed through responsibility, through shared work, through mutual dependence. Relationships were not abstract bonds, but practical ones. People needed one another, not emotionally alone, but materially. This made connection unavoidable and therefore meaningful. Conflict, when it arose, was not pushed outward into war or turned inward into isolation. It was held within the community through ritual, conversation, and repetition until it softened or transformed. Resolution was not dramatic. It was gradual. It was not about victory, but about restoration. Life in such a world would not have felt easy, but it would have felt held. There would have been loss, hunger, illness, and fear, but there would also have been shared response to those things. No one faced difficulty alone, because no one existed alone. This creates an emotional difference that is difficult to translate into modern language. It is the difference between being part of something and standing inside something, between having a role and having an identity, between belonging because you choose to and belonging because you are needed. A forgotten morning in such a world would not have felt empty or urgent. It would have felt full in a quiet way, full of small repetitions, familiar faces, known tasks, and shared meaning. Nothing would have felt extraordinary because everything would have felt necessary. This is the intimacy hidden inside the mystery. Not the intimacy of secrets, but the intimacy of lives lived close together and close to the world that held them. This is what makes the idea of their disappearance feel strange, not because something great was lost, but because something ordinary was lost. Something so ordinary that it became invisible. Something so present that it no longer stood out. And yet that ordinariness is what made it powerful. It shaped people who did not need to stand apart from one another or from their world to feel complete. It created a sense of self that was relational rather than isolated, inherited rather than constructed. This is what they may have passed on without knowing they were passing it on. Not their names, not their stories, not their achievements, but their way of being with one another. Their way of raising children, their way of caring for elders, their way of living within limits without feeling confined. That is how a civilization can outlive itself. Not by preserving its form, but by embedding its values into everyday life. And from this intimacy, the story can move toward its final transformation, from how they lived to what they left behind, from presence to legacy, and from memory to meaning. That is where the next layer quietly waits. It is possible that the forgotten civilization did not vanish by accident, nor fade because it was weak, nor disappear because it was defeated. It may have faded because it did not need to remain visible. Its aim may not have been to be remembered, but to continue. This is a difficult idea to accept, because modern cultures are built around memory. We preserve, record, archive, and display because we fear loss and equate survival with recognition. We build monuments to protect ourselves from forgetting. We write histories to protect ourselves from erasure. We leave marks so that something of us will remain when we no longer do. But this older civilization may not have shared that fear. It may have trusted continuity more than remembrance. It may have believed that if something truly mattered, it did not need to be named or preserved. It only needed to be lived. In that worldview, the future was not something separate from the present. It was the present, unfolding. There was no need to leave a message for later generations, because later generations were already part of the same ongoing story. What was passed on was not a record but a practice, not a monument but a way of living. Seen this way, the absence of monuments is not a failure of memory but an expression of confidence. It is a sign that they did not feel the need to announce themselves to the future. They trusted that what they created would be carried forward naturally through people, through land, and through rhythm. They did not choose to be forgotten. They chose not to stand apart. They did not vanish. They merged. They did not erase themselves. They embedded themselves. This reframes disappearance as intention rather than loss. It becomes a form of humility, a willingness to dissolve into what comes next rather than dominate it. It becomes a choice to prioritize continuity over identity and influence over recognition. Such a choice would feel strange to a culture that values legacy in the form of names, structures, and achievements. But it would feel natural to a culture that values legacy in the form of relationships, habits, and ways of seeing. In such a world, the highest success would not be to be remembered, but to become unnecessary, to create something so stable, so balanced, and so alive that it no longer needs protection or attention, to shape a way of living that continues on its own without needing to be defended or declared. This is a quiet form of power, one that does not look like power at all. It does not command. It does not conquer. It does not endure through force. It endures through relevance. When something remains useful, it remains alive. When it remains alive, it does not need to be remembered. This may be why the civilization left no clear trace of itself as a separate entity. It was not interested in being separate. It was interested in being part of the flow of life that would continue after it. In this sense, choosing to vanish is not an act of disappearance, but an act of trust. It is trust that the future will be capable of carrying what matters. It is trust that the world does not need a guardian to remain whole. It is trust that life itself is enough. This trust is difficult to feel from a distance. It feels almost reckless to a culture trained to secure, preserve, and protect. But it may be the deepest form of care, because it does not seek to control what comes next. It simply prepares it. This is what gives the story its final emotional turn. The mystery is no longer about what was lost, but about what was given. The civilization did not leave behind a puzzle. It left behind a foundation. And that foundation is not stone or record or name. It is a way of being that still shapes how people live, how they relate, how they understand time, land, and one another. With this understanding, the story is ready to turn toward the modern world, not to compare it or judge it, but to ask what it means to live inside an inheritance we did not ask for, did not notice, and are only now beginning to sense. That is where the next chapter begins. The past rarely returns in the way people expect it to. It does not arrive with announcements, discoveries, or sudden certainty. It returns as a question, as a feeling that something does not quite fit, as a quiet sense that a story has more beneath it than what has been told. This return is not dramatic. It is gentle, personal, and often invisible to anyone except the person experiencing it. It often begins with small acts of attention. Someone walks the same path every day and notices that it curves in a way that does not serve the present landscape. Someone reads a local legend and feels that it points towards something older than the words used to tell it. Someone looks at a hill, a spring, or a stone circle, and wonders why it is there rather than somewhere else. These questions are not driven by ambition or authority. They are driven by curiosity and by a sense that something is unfinished. This kind of rediscovery does not happen in institutions first. It happens in individuals. It happens when someone cares enough to look closely, slowly, and without expectation of reward. It happens when someone listens not for answers, but for echoes. Often these people are not professionals or experts. They are walkers, readers, listeners, and watchers. They are people who are willing to be puzzled, who are willing to sit with uncertainty, rather than rush toward explanation. They do not seek to solve the past. They seek to notice it. This makes the return of the past feel lonely. It is difficult to share a question that has no clear answer. It is difficult to convince others to care about something that does not yet have a name. So these questions often remain private for a long time, carried quietly by those who feel them. The rediscovery of the past, therefore, does not feel like progress. It feels like pause. It feels like slowing down enough to sense that something is missing. It feels like standing in a familiar place and realizing that familiarity has hidden depth rather than erased it. This is why the past returns not as knowledge, but as incompleteness, not as certainty, but as invitation. It does not say what was, it asks what might have been. And that is enough to begin. People start to trace footpaths, not to map them, but to understand them. They start to collect stories, not to prove them, but to feel their shape. They start to compare places, not to categorize them, but to notice how they resonate with one another. In doing so, they are not uncovering a new world, they are noticing an old one. This is not the kind of work that produces headlines. It does not create immediate conclusions or dramatic revelations. It creates a shift in perception. It changes how people see the land, how they hear stories, and how they understand time. And that change is often invisible to others. This is why rediscovery feels quiet. It is not a movement. It is a mood. It is not a campaign. It is a conversation, and often one held only between a person and the world. Yet this quietness is not weakness. It is what allows the past to return without being turned into spectacle. It allows memory to surface without being forced into narrative too quickly. It is a kind of listening that modern life rarely encourages. And when enough people begin to listen in this way, something begins to shift. The past does not become louder. The present becomes more attentive. That is the true return. Not the return of what was, but the return of the ability to notice what still is. And from this gentle noticing, the story is ready to move toward its next tension, because not everyone is comfortable with questions that do not lead to simple answers. Not everyone welcomes uncertainty. Some resist it, some fear it, some try to close it again. That is where the next layer begins. Not every question feels welcome, even when it is asked gently. Some questions disturb not because they are hostile, but because they loosen something that feels stable. The idea of a forgotten civilization beneath familiar history does exactly this. It does not threaten with danger, but with uncertainty, and uncertainty is often more unsettling than conflict. Modern identity is built on stories that feel solid. We tell ourselves where we come from, how we arrived here, and why our present makes sense. These stories do not only explain the past, they support meaning in the present. They help people feel oriented, justified, and connected to something larger than themselves. When a story suggests that something important has been forgotten, it does not simply add information. It changes orientation. It introduces the idea that the present is not only the result of what we remember, but also of what we do not. This can feel threatening not because it accuses, but because it unbalances. Progress depends on direction. It depends on the idea that time moves forward in a meaningful way, and that what comes later is better, more advanced, or more complete than what came before. A forgotten civilization challenges that idea by suggesting that something valuable may have existed earlier, and that value may not be linear. National stories depend on beginnings. They depend on moments of arrival, founding, conquest, or unification that can be pointed to and celebrated. A forgotten civilization complicates these moments by suggesting that nothing truly began where we say it did, and that the land and its people were never as empty or undefined as those stories imply. Cultural superiority depends on comparison. It depends on the idea that some ways of living are more developed, more advanced, or more refined than others. The suggestion that a quiet, non-monumental civilization could be deeply intelligent and stable without leaving grand traces unsettles that hierarchy. None of this feels comfortable, because it loosens the structures that hold collective self-understanding in place. This discomfort does not come from malice, it comes from attachment. People become attached to stories that make them feel safe, proud, or certain. These stories provide coherence. They help people know who they are. When a story introduces ambiguity, it can feel like a loss, even when nothing is being taken away. So the resistance to this idea is not a rejection of the past, it is a protection of the present. It is a way of keeping the narrative under control. Control over narrative is a form of emotional security. It allows people to predict meaning, to anticipate direction, and to feel that the world is understandable. A story that refuses to fit neatly into that narrative does not offer replacement certainty. It offers openness, and openness can feel like emptiness when one is used to closure. This is why the idea of a forgotten civilization is often met with silence, dismissal, or mild irritation, rather than with curiosity. It does not promise answers, it promises questions. It does not resolve tension, it introduces it. And tension is uncomfortable. But discomfort is not a sign of falsehood. It is often a sign of depth. When a story feels too easy, it rarely changes anything. When a story feels difficult, it has the power to change how people see. This is why the discomfort matters. It shows where identity is attached to narrative, where meaning is tied to certainty, and where openness is resisted because it feels like loss. The story does not ask people to abandon their past. It asks them to hold it more gently. It asks them to allow that their story may not be complete, that their identity may not be singular, and that their place in time may be more layered than they were taught. This is not an accusation, it is an invitation. An invitation to shift from control to curiosity. An invitation to replace certainty with attention. An invitation to allow that something meaningful can exist without needing to be claimed, named, or owned. And from that invitation, the story can begin to move toward reconciliation, not between past and present, but between certainty and openness, between narrative and mystery, and between what we think we know and what we are still capable of listening to. That is where the next layer begins. There is another way to relate to the past that does not involve claiming it, correcting it, or turning it into proof of anything, and that way is listening. Listening does not demand answers or rush toward conclusions, and it does not try to extract value or authority from what it hears. It allows the past to be present in its own form and at its own pace, and it accepts that not everything that matters can be translated into explanation. When the past is treated as something to own, it becomes a resource that can be shaped to serve present needs, and stories are selected, emphasized, or softened according to what they are expected to support. Memory becomes a tool for identity, pride, or justification, and history becomes a means of control. Listening offers a different posture by approaching the past, not as a possession but as a relationship that continues whether or not we participate in it. Listening requires humility, because it asks us to accept that not everything can be known, named, or resolved, and that some meanings exist beyond the reach of certainty. It requires patience with ambiguity and a willingness to remain present with what does not immediately make sense. In this posture, remembering becomes less about recovery and more about recognition, and less about authority and more about respect. When we listen in this way, the past stops being something we look at and becomes something we look with, shaping how we see the present rather than simply explaining the past. Questions become invitations to notice more carefully rather than problems to solve, and uncertainty becomes a space of openness rather than a failure of understanding. This changes how we treat what we do not understand, because instead of dismissing it or forcing it into familiar categories, we allow it to remain what it is, even when it feels strange or incomplete. This protects the past from being reduced to what we already know, and it protects us from shrinking the world to the size of our language and concepts. Listening in this way becomes a form of care because it shapes how we move through the world and how we treat what we inherit. It encourages gentleness toward land, patience toward culture, and humility toward history. It reminds us that the world we inhabit was shaped by many lives besides our own, and that our role is not only to understand it, but to live within it responsibly. When we listen rather than own, we begin to see land not as property but as relationship, culture not as possession but as gift, and history not as something behind us but as something around us. Knowledge becomes something that changes us rather than something we use, and memory becomes something we participate in rather than something we control. In this way, personal meaning grows not from certainty but from attentiveness, not from explanation but from relationship, and not from mastery but from care. The past becomes not a story we tell, but a presence we live with, and that presence begins to shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the larger flow of time. From this place of listening, the story naturally turns inward toward personal meaning and responsibility, because what we attend to shapes who we become, and how we listen to the past shapes how we live in the present. The past does not live behind us in the way we often imagine. It does not remain fixed in records, ruins, or dates, waiting to be discovered and described. It lives within us, in habits that feel natural, in values that feel obvious, and in rhythms that feel inevitable. It moves through the present quietly, shaping how people think, feel, and act long after its original form has faded from memory. When a civilization dissolves into what comes after it, its most durable elements are not its buildings or its names, but its ways of being. It leaves behind not artifacts, but patterns of life. These patterns settle into culture, into family life, into social expectation, and into personal intuition. Over time, they become indistinguishable from what feels natural or normal, and their origins become invisible. This is how ancestry becomes more than genetic. It becomes emotional, cultural, and perceptual. People inherit not only traits of body, but traits of attention, ways of responding to change, ways of caring for others, and ways of relating to the world around them. These inheritances are not written down, but they are lived, and because they are lived, they endure. This is why the past feels present even when it is not named. It appears in the comfort people feel in certain landscapes, in the pull toward particular ways of gathering, and in the instinct to value certain forms of life over others. These instincts are not random. They are shaped by generations of experience that have been carried forward quietly through behavior rather than through explanation. The forgotten civilization may therefore be closer than imagined. It may not be something to find beneath the ground or within old texts, but something already at work in the present. It may be present in how people seek balance rather than dominance, in how they sense the importance of care, in how they respond to cycles of change with patience rather than panic. When people feel drawn to certain ways of living without knowing why, they are responding not to ideas, but to inheritance. When they feel discomfort with excessive speed, isolation, or control, they are not necessarily rejecting the present, but remembering something older. These reactions are not nostalgic. They are relational. This reframes the story entirely. It is no longer about observing the past from a distance. It becomes about recognizing how the past is already participating in the present. It becomes about noticing the ways people are living inside a legacy they did not choose, but that continues to shape them. This recognition can be unsettling because it blurs the boundary between then and now. It suggests that identity is not purely individual or contemporary, but layered and extended across time. It suggests that the self is not only a product of choice, but also of inheritance. This does not reduce personal freedom. It situates it. It shows that every choice is made within a context that did not begin with the chooser. It reveals that responsibility does not start with the present moment, but is inherited along with everything else. To feel the past as a living presence is to feel that life is shared not only with those around us, but with those who came before us. It is to feel that we are participants in a story that did not start with us and will not end with us. This changes the meaning of responsibility. It becomes less about control and more about care, less about ownership and more about stewardship, less about building something new and more about tending what already exists. In this way, the past does not weigh on the present. It supports it. It offers depth rather than burden, continuity rather than constraint, and meaning rather than obligation. From this sense of presence, the story naturally moves toward responsibility, because once people recognize that they are carrying something forward, they must decide how they will carry it. and what kind of future they are quietly shaping through the ways they live now. That is where the next layer begins to form. Much of what shapes us does not arrive with a name or a story attached to it. It enters quietly through habit, through imitation, through what feels normal long before it feels chosen. We inherit ways of seeing the world, ways of responding to others, and ways of understanding what matters without being told that we are inheriting anything at all. This kind of inheritance does not travel through documents or declarations. It travels through presence. From childhood onward, people absorb how to speak, how to listen, how to treat one another, and how to move through the world by watching what is done around them. They learn what is safe, what is valued, and what is expected not through instruction but through atmosphere. These lessons are not announced, but they are persistent, shaping behavior and identity in ways that are difficult to trace back to any single source. This is how tradition survives without being recognized as tradition. It is not preserved as rule or ritual alone, but as pattern. A way of greeting becomes a way of respecting. A way of sharing becomes a way of caring. A way of waiting becomes a way of trusting. Over time, these patterns feel natural rather than inherited, and what was once taught becomes what simply is. In this sense, inheritance is not legal or material. It is relational. It is the transmission of meaning through lived experience rather than through record. It is how a culture moves forward without carrying its name, and how values endure even when their origins are forgotten. This is why people can feel connected to a place they have never studied, loyal to a way of life they cannot describe, or drawn to a form of meaning they cannot justify. They are responding not to information, but to inheritance that lives inside them as familiarity, preference, and intuition. This kind of inheritance does not belong to individuals alone. It belongs to communities, landscapes, and histories that shape people long before they are aware of being shaped. It moves through families, through neighborhoods, through repeated gestures and shared experiences that accumulate into culture. Because it is invisible, this inheritance is powerful. It does not announce itself. It does not invite examination. It simply continues. It shapes choices before choices are recognized as choices, and it influences values before values are named. This can be comforting, because it offers continuity and belonging without requiring effort. It can also be limiting, because what is inherited unconsciously is rarely questioned. The same invisible transmission that carries care and connection can also carry fear, habit, and assumption. To notice what we inherit without knowing is therefore not only an act of curiosity, but an act of responsibility. It allows us to see that not everything we carry is ours, and not everything we carry is necessary. This is not a call to reject inheritance, but to become aware of it. Awareness creates space. Space creates choice. When we begin to see that we have inherited ways of seeing, relating, and caring, we also begin to see that we can choose how to continue them. We can decide what to deepen, what to soften, and what to release. We can participate in the flow of tradition rather than simply being moved by it. In this way, inheritance becomes poetic rather than legal. It is not about ownership, entitlement, or possession. It is about continuity, participation, and relationship. It is about recognizing that we are shaped by what came before us, and that what we do now will shape what comes after us. This recognition does not diminish individuality. It deepens it. It situates the self within a larger story, making personal meaning part of something that extends beyond personal time. From this understanding, the story naturally moves toward choice, because once we recognize what we carry, we can begin to ask how we wish to carry it, and what kind of future we are shaping through the ways we live, relate, and care in the present. That is where the next layer of the story begins. Once the past is felt, not as something behind us, but as something moving through us, the question shifts from what happened to what we will do with what we have received. Inheritance is no longer only about what has been passed down, but about what is being passed on. This makes remembering an active process rather than a passive one, and it places the present at the center of the long story rather than at its edge. What we carry forward is rarely chosen all at once. It is shaped through daily actions, through repeated habits, through small decisions that feel ordinary but accumulate into patterns. The future is not built by grand gestures alone. It is shaped by the tone of everyday life, by how people treat one another, by how they respond to change, and by what they protect when no one is watching. This is why the forgotten worldview matters not as a model to be copied, but as a source of questions to be lived with. It invites reflection rather than instruction. It asks whether balance still has a place in a world driven by speed, whether care can remain central in a world organized around efficiency, and whether patience can survive in a culture that celebrates urgency. These are not problems to solve, but directions to consider. To choose what to carry forward is not to return to the past, but to allow certain qualities of it to inform the present. It is to ask how continuity might coexist with change, how responsibility might coexist with freedom, and how meaning might be found not in accumulation, but in relationship. This kind of choosing does not feel dramatic. It feels quiet. It happens when someone decides to slow down rather than hurry, to listen rather than react, to share rather than compete, and to tend rather than take. These choices rarely appear significant on their own, but together they shape the emotional climate in which a future grows. In this sense, hope does not come from certainty about what will happen. It comes from care about how it will happen. It comes from the knowledge that the future is not an abstract place we move toward, but a condition we are constantly creating through how we live now. Remembering becomes a way of choosing, because it allows people to see what has lasted and why it lasted. It shows which ways of being supported life and which exhausted it. It reveals what created resilience and what created fragility. This awareness does not dictate behavior, but it informs it. When people remember in this way, they do not become bound by the past. They become guided by it. The past becomes a teacher rather than a rule, a presence rather than a demand. This is why remembering can be hopeful. It reconnects people to a sense of continuity that extends beyond individual time. It offers a way to belong to something larger without needing to control it. It reminds people that they are not alone in shaping the world, and that their choices matter not because they are heroic, but because they are repeated. The forgotten civilization does not offer answers for the future. It offers a way of asking better questions. It invites people to consider not what they can build, but what they can sustain. Not what they can achieve, but what they can preserve. And not what they can claim, but what they can care for. In this way, the story does not end with revelation. It ends with reflection. It does not close with certainty. It opens with possibility. The future becomes not a destination to reach, but a field to tend. It becomes something that grows slowly through attention, through responsibility, and through relationship. And that is perhaps the most meaningful inheritance of all, the understanding that what we carry forward is not only what we remember, but how we remember, and that remembering itself is a form of care. From this place of gentle attention, the story is ready to come to rest, not because it is finished, but because it has reached a point of stillness where listening matters more than speaking. That is where the final chapter begins to breathe. There is a quiet assumption beneath many questions that every mystery exists in order to be solved. We are taught to look for answers, to seek clarity, and to move forward once something has been explained. This instinct is useful in many parts of life, but it does not fit every kind of question. Some mysteries do not offer resolution because their purpose is not to conclude, but to invite attention. The idea of a forgotten civilization beneath familiar history does not behave like a problem with a solution. It behaves like a doorway that opens onto a deeper way of seeing. Each layer of the story does not close the question, but expands it, revealing that what matters most is not what is hidden, but how we respond to what we cannot fully know. This reframes the role of mystery itself. Mystery becomes not a gap in understanding, but a space for relationship. It is where curiosity lives, where humility begins, and where the mind loosens its grip on certainty. In this sense, mystery is not the opposite of knowledge, but the ground from which meaningful knowledge grows. When people feel uncomfortable with open questions, it is often because they associate uncertainty with insecurity. They want answers in order to feel safe, oriented, and in control. But some kinds of safety come not from control but from trust, and some kinds of orientation come not from maps but from presence. A mystery that remains open teaches patience. It teaches listening. It teaches the ability to stay with something that does not immediately yield meaning. This kind of staying is rare in a culture that rewards speed and resolution, but it is essential for depth. The forgotten civilization, in this light, becomes less a puzzle to be solved and more a presence to be acknowledged. It reminds us that reality is larger than what can be described, that history is deeper than what can be recorded, and that meaning is not exhausted by explanation. This does not make the story empty. It makes it alive. An open mystery continues to shape those who encounter it. It invites reflection rather than conclusion, and it asks not what we know, but how we see. It becomes a mirror not of facts, but of attention. In this way, the story itself becomes an example of what it describes. It does not arrive at a final answer. It arrives at a way of looking. It does not end with certainty. It ends with awareness. This is not a failure of storytelling. It is its fulfillment. A story that closes too neatly often stops living. A story that remains open continues to move through the listener, changing slowly as the listener changes. It becomes something people carry with them rather than something they leave behind. For late-night listeners, for those who seek calm rather than closure, this openness is not unsettling. It is comforting. It allows the mind to rest inside a question rather than race toward an answer. It offers a form of stillness that is not empty but attentive. In that stillness, curiosity does not fade. It softens. It becomes less a hunger and more a presence, less a drive and more a quiet companion. This is why some mysteries should stay open, not because they cannot be solved, but because they are not meant to be. They exist to keep us awake to the world, not in the sense of alertness, but in the sense of awareness. They remind us that there is always more than what we see, more than what we know, and more than what we can name. And in that more, life continues to unfold. From this openness, the story naturally moves towards stillness, not as an ending, but as a resting place, where listening becomes deeper than speaking, and noticing becomes more meaningful than knowing. That is where the final movement begins. There is a subtle difference between remembering something and trying to possess it. Remembering allows what came before to remain what it was, while possession tries to pull it into the present and reshape it according to present needs. When we try to own the past, we treat it as material, as something that can be claimed, used, and organized. But the past is not an object and does not behave like one. The past is not a thing we can hold. It is a condition we live inside. We are shaped by what came before us in ways we can never fully trace or control. Language, customs, values, and even the ways we understand ourselves are inherited from countless lives that we will never meet. We do not stand outside this inheritance. We stand within it. This realization invites humility, not as self-diminishment, but as perspective. It places the self inside a much larger movement of time, life, and meaning. It reminds us that we are participants rather than owners, carriers rather than authors, and listeners rather than masters. The forgotten civilization becomes a teacher, not because it provides information, but because it models restraint. It did not attempt to declare itself permanent. It did not insist on recognition. It did not seek to dominate the future. Instead, it trusted continuity more than memory and relationship more than record. This restraint offers a lesson that feels rare in a culture built around accumulation and display. It suggests that not everything meaningful needs to be preserved in visible form, and not everything valuable needs to be named or claimed. When we stop trying to own the past, our relationship to it softens. It becomes less about control and more about care, less about authority and more about responsibility, less about what we can take from it, and more about what we can learn from being shaped by it. In this posture, history becomes a teacher, not through facts alone, but through presence. It teaches patience by its depth, humility by its scale, and gentleness by its persistence. This does not mean that study, research, or memory lose their value. It means that they are held within a larger attitude of respect. We seek to understand not in order to master, but in order to relate. This change in posture is subtle, but it transforms everything. It changes how we speak about the past, how we protect what remains, and how we situate ourselves in time. It allows us to see that we do not inherit the world in order to own it, but in order to care for it. This is why the idea that we belong to the past, rather than the past belonging to us, feels both unsettling and comforting. It unsettles the desire for control, but it comforts the desire for connection. It replaces ownership with belonging and possession with participation. This is not a loss of agency. It is a deepening of it. It places our actions within a longer context and gives them weight beyond the present moment. It shows that what we do matters not only because it affects us, but because it enters a stream that will continue long after we are gone. From this perspective, humility becomes a form of strength. It frees us from the need to define ourselves through dominance, and it allows us to define ourselves through relationship. It opens space for care, patience, and attentiveness to become guiding values. This is the beauty of not owning the past. It allows the past to remain vast rather than small, alive rather than fixed, and meaningful rather than useful. It allows us to stand inside time rather than above it, and to feel supported by something larger than ourselves. From this sense of humility, the story can move toward peace, not as an end, but as a quality of relationship with time, memory, and life itself. That is where the final movement gently begins. As the story draws towards stillness, it does not arrive at a conclusion so much as a quiet place. The energy that once moved through questions and patterns now settles into something simpler and more spacious. Fields continue to open and close with the light. Wind continues to move across hills without needing a name. Stone continues to hold the weight of time without remembering who first placed it. Life does not pause when stories end. It only continues without asking to be watched. The forgotten civilization no longer feels like something separate or hidden. It feels like part of the land's long breathing, a presence that has blended into the rhythm of growth and decay, of appearance and disappearance. It is no longer a subject of inquiry, but a condition of the world itself, something that exists not as memory, but as continuity. This changes how endings feel. An ending is no longer a point where something stops existing, but a point where attention shifts. The story does not disappear, it simply rests. It becomes background rather than foreground, atmosphere rather than object. In this way, rest becomes a form of respect. It is the moment when the mind stops reaching, and the world is allowed to be what it is, without explanation. It is the moment when curiosity softens into presence, and listening becomes deeper than questioning. For those who come here, not to solve, but to feel, this resting place is not empty. It is full in a quiet way. It is filled with wind and light and shadow, with the sense that something larger than understanding is still moving, still shaping, still holding. This is why emotional closure does not require finality. It requires permission to stop holding, to stop defining, and to stop trying to complete what was never meant to be complete. The land does not complete itself. It continues. The past does not complete itself. It flows into what comes next. Meaning does not complete itself. It deepens through relationship. And so the story rests not because it has finished, but because it has reached a point where finishing is no longer needed. This is where the listener is invited not to leave the story, but to carry it lightly, without grasping, without urgency, and without expectation. It becomes something like a feeling rather than a thought, something like a tone rather than a message. The world remains as it always has, layered, alive, and quietly unfolding. Fields will grow and be cut, stones will warm and cool, paths will be walked and softened, time will move and return. None of this requires our attention, and yet it welcomes it. This is the gentle paradox at the heart of rest. We do not have to watch the world for it to be meaningful, but when we do watch it with softness, meaning becomes easier to feel. Letting the story rest is therefore not an act of forgetting. It is an act of trust. It is trusting that what matters does not need to be held tightly, that what endures does not need to be protected, and that what is alive does not need to be defined. In this trust, the story becomes part of the listener's inner landscape, not as information, but as atmosphere. It becomes something that can be returned to, not as a narrative, but as a feeling of depth, of patience, and of belonging to a world that is older, larger, and gentler than any single story. From this resting place, the final reflection can arise naturally, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet echo of what has already been felt. That is where the story breathes once more, before settling into silence. When the story returns to the island, it does not return to a place on a map, a political boundary, or a historical object, but to land itself, to soil and stone, to wind and water, and to the slow shaping forces that existed before names and will continue after them. Britain in this sense is not a nation but a presence, a form that holds time within it without needing to explain it. The island does not choose answers, but patience, and it does not decide what should be remembered or forgotten, so much as allow memory to settle where it will, to deepen where it is tended, and to fade where it is no longer needed. It does not resist change, and it does not hurry it, but simply holds what passes through it and allows it to become part of what it is. Fields are ploughed and left to rest, forests grow and thin, rivers change their edges, and villages appear, shift, and sometimes disappear, all of which is held without preference, judgment, or urgency. The land does not keep records but continuity, and it carries layers of life without sorting them into chapters, allowing different times to exist together in the same place, like overlapping shadows that do not cancel one another. When people try to fix the story of the land into a single meaning, something often feels lost because the story becomes smaller and the land becomes background. But when the land is allowed to remain participant rather than object, something opens, and the island becomes not something we look at, but something we live with. This changes the role of the listener as well, because the listener is no longer outside the story, but inside it, moving through it, shaped by it, and shaping it in return, so that every step taken on the land is a continuation of the story, whether it is noticed or not. In this way, the land does not ask to be interpreted so much as inhabited, and it does not ask for understanding so much as relationship, which does not require answers but attention, care, and time. This is why the island does not resolve the mystery of the forgotten civilization, but absorbs it, not explaining it, but holding it, so that the past becomes part of the land's texture, rather than part of its narrative, and remains alive rather than fixed. The island remembers so that people do not have to, remembering in stone and root and water, in paths that remain even when their names fade, and in places that continue to draw human presence without demanding explanation, so that memory becomes environmental rather than mental, and distributed rather than centralized. This is a form of generosity that frees people from the burden of having to carry everything themselves, allowing forgetting to be part of remembering and change to be part of continuity. And in that freedom, people are able to live more lightly inside time, able to belong without owning, care without controlling, and listen without trying to conclude. The island, in this sense, is not a container of history, but a participant in it, holding not the story apart from us, but holding us within the story. And as this is felt, the narrative is ready to move, one last time, inward toward the listener and toward the quiet realization that this story has never been only about a civilization or a place, but about a way of being in time. As the story turns toward the listener, it does not ask them to believe anything new or accept any conclusion, but simply to notice that listening itself has already changed their relationship to what they have heard. The act of listening has quietly woven them into the story, not as an observer standing outside it, but as a participant carrying its questions, its tone, and its way of seeing into their own life. By listening, the listener has already become a carrier, not of answers, but of awareness, not of facts, but of attention. The story has not given them something to hold, but something to notice, and noticing is what allows meaning to move from one moment to the next. This is how stories live. They do not survive because they are written down or repeated exactly. They survive because they change the way people see, feel, and relate, and those changes then move outward into behavior, into conversation, into choice, and into care. The forgotten civilization does not need to be preserved as knowledge in order to continue existing. It continues through influence. It continues through shifts in perception. It continues through the quiet changes that occur when someone begins to see land as presence rather than property, time as relationship rather than pressure, and history as continuity rather than record. In this way, the listener is not receiving the story so much as continuing it. What they carry forward is not information, but a sensibility, not a message, but a mood, not a theory, but a way of paying attention. This creates a subtle bond between the story and the listener. It is not a bond of belief or agreement, but a bond of shared listening. Both the story and the listener have been shaped by the same act of attention, and that attention now lives beyond the moment in which it was formed. This is why remembering in this sense is something done together. It is not an individual achievement, but a collective process. It does not belong to one person or one time, but to the movement of awareness through people and through generations. When the listener carries this awareness into the world, they are not carrying a burden. They are carrying a lightness. They are not tasked with protecting the past. They are invited to live with it. This changes what responsibility feels like. It becomes less about preservation and more about presence, less about guarding what was and more about caring for what is. This is a gentle form of responsibility because it does not demand effort. It invites attentiveness. It does not ask for action. It asks for relationship. In this way, the listener becomes part of a continuity that does not depend on institutions or authority. They become part of a living transmission that moves through listening, through noticing, and through care. And when this is felt, the story does not need to continue. It can release itself. It can step back into stillness. It can become quiet again. The listener does not lose it in this quiet. They carry it differently. Not as a story they remember, but as a way they listen. Not as a truth they own, but as a presence they move with. And in that movement, the story continues without needing to be told again. From this shared memory, the story is ready to release itself completely, allowing what has been heard to settle into silence, where it can become something new. That is where the final moment gently arrives. As the story releases itself, it does not move toward an ending so much as toward a pause. It does not close a door or finish a sentence, but settles into quiet in the same way the evening settles into night, gradually and without announcement. The questions that once carried motion soften into stillness, and the attention that once searched now simply rests. The world continues in this quiet. Breath continues, wind continues, time continues. The land does not wait for stories to finish before it moves on, and life does not require explanation in order to unfold. The forgotten civilization, once felt as something hidden or lost, is no longer something to look for. It is something that is felt in the rhythm of the present, in the way light fades, in the way air cools, in the way silence grows gentle rather than empty. This is not disappearance, it is integration. The story becomes part of the background of awareness rather than the object of it. It becomes atmosphere rather than narrative, presence rather than subject. In this resting place, nothing needs to be resolved. There is no final understanding to reach, and no conclusion to defend. The need to know gives way to the ability to notice, and the need to hold gives way to the ability to allow. This is the gift of rest. It does not remove meaning. It deepens it by releasing it from effort. When the story rests, it becomes something that can be lived rather than remembered, something that can be felt rather than spoken, and something that can be returned to not as a text but as a tone. Night arrives without needing permission. Darkness does not ask to be understood. It simply arrives, and in arriving, it offers a kind of shelter from explanation. In the dark, the world becomes simpler. Edges soften, distances shrink, the need to define loosens its hold. This is why the story rests in night, not because it is finished, but because night is where things are allowed to be what they are without being named. The forgotten civilization now belongs to this space. It no longer needs to be pointed to or described. It has become part of the feeling of continuity that holds the world together, part of the sense that life is larger than any one moment, and part of the quiet trust that what matters does not need to announce itself. The listener does not carry the story forward by repeating it. They carry it by living with the attentiveness it invited. They carry it by noticing the land, by feeling time, by treating what they inherit with care rather than control. In this way, the story does not travel forward. It spreads inward. It becomes something that shapes how the listener stands, how they breathe, and how they belong. And so the story rests, not because it has nowhere else to go, but because it has arrived where it belongs, in the space between thought and feeling, between past and present, between what is known and what is lived. Here, there is no need for words. There is only breath. There is only quiet. There is only the sense of being part of something that did not begin with us and will not end with us. And that is enough. The story rests here, not as an ending, but as a pause within a much larger movement that continues without us needing to follow it. In that pause, there is peace. In that peace, there is presence. And in that presence, there is rest.